Hello everybody, I hope you're all well. Welcome back to another Doctor Who Big Finish audio drama review. In today's review, we are stepping back into the world of 1960s Doctor Who with Volume 3 of the First Doctor Adventures, entitled Fugitive of the Daleks, of course featuring Stephen Noonan as the recast First Doctor at Big Finish, alongside, rather excitingly, Maureen O'Brien as Vicki, of course from the original 60s Doctor Who, and of course Lauren Cornelius as Dodo Chaplet. This release is available to order now on the Big Finish website on both physical CD and digital download, and can also be purchased as part of a bundle alongside the other volumes within this series. So we've got a rather exciting box set this time round. Not that the other sets weren't exciting, they were. I've really came to love this series over the past few years. Previously, I didn't really listen to the 60s stuff at Big Finish, I must admit. I wasn't really invested in the early adventures. I did, of course, listen to some of the David Bradley First Doctor stories. However, I think that this range with Noonan as the First Doctor has really captured my imagination and revamped the 60s Doctor Who era in the audio form to bring something really fresh and exciting, and this box set is no exception. So this time round we have one big 6-part epic, seeing the return of an older version of Vicki alongside the First Doctor, following on from the events of Volume 2, although there isn't particularly much connecting it to Volume 2, it just merely continues on from the cliffhanger. So before we go on to the actual story itself, I would just like to mention Christopher Naylor's absolutely beautiful cover artwork. Once again, this is an actual hand-drawn illustration and painted. It is beautiful, and I really hope we see more of this in the future. I do in fact have the physical CD, and it feels so special to have a cover art like this, and it's just so different to what we are used to, so yeah, I really hope we see more, and it excellently sells this set as well. Also, a big shout out to the people who have worked on this series: Nicholas Briggs, script editing and directing, as well as of course being the executive producer, as well as Luke and Toby on the music and sound design. This episode feels very 60s, it's kind of stripped back, but also has all of those lovely components that you expect from a 60s Doctor Who story. Mark Wright as the producer, a really consistent producer I found with this series so far, but also Jonathan Morris for writing a reference-packed story, really embracing 60s Doctor Who, the characters of the era, but also bringing in some exciting new stuff as well. I think that this episode is quite the roller coaster, and yeah, I really do recommend it actually. I'm going to say that before I've even got into the actual details themselves, although I recommend pacing the listening of this one, because I think if you listen to it all within one sitting, I don't think you'll be able to appreciate all of the little references and plot details. I think this is an episode to savour. Listen to a part, go away for a bit, come back to it, boil a cup of tea, listen to another episode, maybe space it over a few days, because it is quite a long one, so it may not be for everybody. I'm going to hold my hands up and say that I wasn't best pleased when I found out that this third volume of the First Doctor Adventures was losing its historical story. It's something of which that I've always looked forward to with the previous volumes, but that being exchanged for a 6-part Dalek epic with the return of Vicki, I think kind of warrants the occasion for the format change. And that isn't to say that this story is actually absent of the period setting, truly embracing the style of many early Dalek stories, using a wide variety of planets and time periods to tell this grand tale. And now that I've listened to the whole set, I'm really glad that this release has actually happened, as it's something that's really celebratory of the era and absolutely ramps up towards the end of the story, feeling very 60s authentic, but something new as well. So Vicki is now much older, she's had a life, a family, lots of memories, and one day the TARDIS crashes back into her life with a rather flustered First Doctor inside. This is a really effective way to open the story. It certainly gives the impression that Vicki has moved on in life, she's a different person, whilst also still embodying that very young 15-year-old who travelled with the Doctor originally. She's someone who looks back on her journeys with the Doctor in fondness, she's made them into stories to tell her grandchildren, but this is kind of her new spark of life, seeing the TARDIS once again. So as I've mentioned, the First Doctor is rather flustered, and this raises quite a lot of questions. So we have the TARDIS being carted off for the Doctor to be fixed back to health, and the newly found TARDIS team find themselves embarking on a chase-style story, starting out on a spaceship known as Perpetuity, and then later a primitive cave world, because why not? Within part 2 there is this lovely cave sacrifice scene with the tribespeople, and I actually had to pause sort of listening because I was giggling too much. Vicky's sarcasm is a perfect match for the First Doctor and his little grumbles. They can't translate what the tribe is actually saying, so the Doctor basically describes these rather aggressive hand gestures that the tribe leader is doing, and it's very, very funny. Much like the previous volumes of this series, this volume is very much of the era. The plot is more gradual, it's more stripped back, but it also has the charm of 60s Doctor Who. I don't think it quite takes itself too seriously, but it's actually got quite a threatening theme at the same time, with the Daleks kind of tracking down the Doctor and Vicki throughout the universe for some unknown reason. Even the food machine makes a lovely return as well, with a nice little sound effects, which is a nice little reference. Part of me wanted them to go all the way and kind of do a few iffy Dalek voices, but I don't think that would have completely sold it due to being in the audio drama format. But I think there is certainly some variety within this story, but they definitely sound a lot more polished than they did back in the day. Heck, I would have even loved some squeaky sound effects in there as well, to sort of represent the operators on the inside, clanging their feet against the BBC studio floor and no doubt absolutely hating their life. The concept of perpetuity at the very beginning of the story is very brief. It kind of lasts for a little bit, well, most of part 1 and then into part 2, and it's a nice way to get the story set off, but then I think once you start to bring in the other locations, you do start to realise, like, how does this all link together? And speaking of how do things link together, the third part sees our TARDIS duo land in 1876 North America after the Civil War, running up to the Battle of Little Big Horn with General Custer. And by this point it's clear that the story is certainly taking inspiration from the likes of The Chase and the Daleks Master Plan, with many varied locations. But I do love how this singular part somewhat tells a little bit of a story. It embraces sort of the historical focus that a lot of 60s Doctor Who had, sort of being bookended by lots of sci-fi stuff going on at the same time, which I think is a really lovely balance. It adds an extra bit of flavour to this story as well. But the Daleks, of course, are hot on their pursuit. For me as a listener, I did start to get a little bit confused around parts 3 and part 4. I did worry that the story was somewhat losing direction because we were seeing these different locations, and I didn't quite understand where the episode was leading to after this, as it seemed that the characters were arriving in a location, it had a problem, they were defeating the problem, and then leaving. It was kind of like mini bite-sized Doctor Who stories, some on Earth, some in space. There's an odd comedic scene with a TARDIS and police public call boxes, which I still don't quite get the full relevance of, but it's fun, and to me that little moment, it kind of reminded me of that weird episode from In the Middle of Daleks Master Plan, where the Daleks are being all evil, and then the Doctor decides, hang on, let's go for a drink, it's Christmas. Then don't bump into the cast of Z Cars or something. Again, it embraces the spontaneity of 60s Doctor Who, and part of me does wonder if, when they were recording it, I'll just do that. It's not like we're going to keep these episodes anyway, we're going to junk them in a few weeks, let's do anything. And due to the episode having all these different locations, I think that it does definitely present a few challenges, especially with this story being one big 3-hour episode. But not only that, it's split into 6 individual half-hour parts as well, which again kind of staggers the structure a little bit, because it means that you have to have a cliffhanger every half an hour, which kind of makes sometimes the plots of classic Doctor Who stories feel a little bit unnatural. But I think when you look at this story as an overall package, I think you just need to go with it and you need to trust it, because I think come the end, I actually came to appreciate the episode quite a lot, but you needed to kind of possess all of the elements of the end of the episode, I think, to fully appreciate it. So just bear with it, because I think it is really fun. I think it's interesting as well when you compare this box set to other similar duration box sets that have been released recently. For example, the Eric Roberts Master Series, Planet Doom, Volume 3 of that series, also 3 hours in duration, but that is split over 3 1-hour stories instead. And again, it's a very different style. I mean, they're 2 very, very different series, but it's interesting to see how the 1-hour format can make a story a bit different, and the pacing of the episodes can feel different as well. But that said, I feel like the half-an-hour approach really adequately fits 60s Doctor Who, and it's rather odd energy that it brings, and that let's do this, now let's do this, now this, now this. But it works, it keeps you on your feet as a listener, and I think that it did definitely keep me engaged, whilst also raising quite a few questions. Come parts 5 and 6, however, I think the story does absolutely establish itself. It ups the game and it delivers lots of action, many heartfelt scenes too. Interestingly, this is also when Dodo reappears within the tale for reasons which I won't completely mention, so I think this maybe acts as a little bit of a kick to the story to bring it to the next stage. We've had quite a lot of focus on Vicki and the First Doctor, then bringing Dodo in I think really helps to balance out the TARDIS team once again and do something new, even though actually for the most part they don't really spend many scenes together as a complete unit. Fugitive of the Daleks is absolutely packed with many funny moments. The Dalek dialogue throughout is so blunt, so sassy, but also a tad bonkers. Why say, oh look, a horse, when you could use the Dalek phrase,
"Alert! Human undomesticated quadruped mammal approaching!"
The First Doctor also says, butter no parsnips, at one point, which I did need to rewind that multiple times, as I just loved it. It was a moment that hit home with me for some reason. I didn't know I needed that in my life, but apparently I do. So yeah, well done Stephen for that delivery, because I was laughing quite a lot. There is also multiple moments in the early half of this story where the First Doctor is somewhat getting manhandled from location to location, be it a tribe, be it the sort of spaceship from part 1. So you have lots of aggressive, unhand me man moments, which again, hilarious. But who can blame him? I mean, he has been taken out of time and put into many locations, and he doesn't quite know where he is, which I think is basically how I feel for most days of the week, so I can relate to him on a spiritual level. I do think as well that this story is very important for the range overall, particularly because it focuses on Stephen Noonan and Maureen O'Brien's performance, particularly as the Doctor and Vicki. And this is really significant because we get Noonan strutting his stuff with all the hums and dear and all of that, and all the endearingness alongside an actual original member of the cast, which is really exciting. I think that this both motivates Noonan and accelerates the performance to really exciting new territories. There is a sharp to the performance. The First Doctor certainly likes things a particular way. To me, the dialogue and his conduct, it still clearly shows a Doctor in his very early time-travelling days. He's less polished. The universe also feels a lot less explored. There's also that warmth in there as well, and a clear care and protectiveness for his friends. I think that is excellently illustrated within this story. I think that it says a lot that this isn't William Hartnell, this is Stephen Noonan interacting with an original companion, and yet within this story, instantly I believed it. I believed that this is Vicki and the First Doctor back again, and it felt very surreal, because I think that friendship is so perfectly embodied between these two leads, because you feel, yes, there is a little bit of confusion between them because they've had time away from each other, but then at the same time as the story progresses, we see this bond starting to come back together again. The cogs within the relationship are starting to work as they once did. I think that is a really beneficial process for both Vicki and the Doctor as well. The narrative also allows Stephen Noonan to do many exciting things, most of which I can't actually mention, like nearly being sacrificed by a tribe, navigating treacherous alien terrains, horse riding as well is thrown in there, because why not? He's certainly a lot more mobile compared to the TV portrayal, but the clever little acknowledgements to him having little breathers and needing to stop for a moment, he feels a bit flustered. When lots of people are talking, he gets a bit confused. I think all of these traits perfectly replicate what we see on screen with Hartnell's Doctor, but also really elevate the audio performance, because I can visualise the First Doctor in my head when listening to this story. And I think that it is a very physical performance, a very visual performance for something of which that you can't actually see, which I personally think is really impressive. In my head, I'm kind of treating this box set as a special event, almost like an anniversary story, and it will be really interesting to see how the events of this box set, and in particular the performance of the First Doctor, and how that will go on to influence the subsequent volumes within this series, as we see Stephen Noonan and Lauren Cornelius return to a more traditional style of 60s Doctor Who story, maybe a pure historical, maybe a one-off sci-fi episode. It'll be interesting to see how the performances within this story influence the next stories within the line. As I say, especially in the story's later half, there's lots of different things which go on, particularly for the First Doctor. And I think that this allows Noonan to shine, showcasing this Doctor's wit, intelligence, strong beliefs, and a lot of heart-tugging, emotional scenes with his companions in there as well. So if you're a fan of the First Doctor, and if you've enjoyed the previous volumes, I think that, again, this set continues to progress the range and take it to a new place of which the 60s televised stories didn't. So I think that this showcases both potential for this range in the future and the subsequent volumes, but also perhaps a new direction for 60s Doctor Who that we otherwise wouldn't have seen with, say, the early adventures with Big Finish. Again, this is another one of the strengths that this series has, revisiting the joys of 60s Doctor Who in a modern world. We hear Vicki and Dodo leading quite a lot of the scenes, a lot more than they would have when on screen, applying their skills to help the Doctor defeat the Daleks' grand plan, and the story pauses as well for quite a few moments for Vicki and Dodo to kind of take stock, as they, after all, have never met before, so we have lots of really strong moments between them, dealing with the fact that they are both very similar people because they've both travelled with the Doctor, but they both bring very different relationships and different dynamics to the story. Which again, actually, when you think about it, is quite interesting because both Dodo and Vicki, or at least Vicki when she first travelled with the Doctor, was quite young, much like how Dodo currently is. The view that I have of this set is very similar to the previous sets within this series as well. I personally think the listener knows in their gut if they are going to enjoy this series. If you are not a fan of recasting Doctors or recasting anyone, then avoid this series like a barge pole. I don't need to tell you that, because you're just going to listen to it and get annoyed because Big Finish haven't got the capability to resurrect William Hartnell. If you're more open to recasting, I think that this series allows for a very exciting opportunity to tell very different 60s style Doctor Who episodes which embrace the origins of Doctor Who whilst breathing new life into it as well. And something that I always take away from these stories is that, very much like 60s Doctor Who itself, there'll be some episodes that are brilliant, some episodes that are a little bit all over the place, and some of which that are hated. And I think that no matter what with this series, even if I come across stories that I don't like as much, I respect the production behind the stories. Within the interviews, it goes into how the written script is very much not the end for this story. Stephen then gets the script, and he then edits the First Doctor's dialogue to make it appear more authentic to the way that Hartnell presents the lines within the series itself. And I think that this is a huge credit to him, because it ultimately makes the stories feel, I think, a lot more real. I think they mentioned around 10 hours worth of meetings go into editing the lines, having and capturing Hartnell's mannerisms, which I think is frankly incredible. And I think that they replicate the style of 60s Doctor Who that well, that the critiques that I have of this box set are very similar to a 60s TV story. At parts it does slow down, at parts I do wonder, what on earth are you doing? I think that there is a lot of spirit within the stories. I think that the characters really leap off the page. The Daleks in particular have lots of sass, they're very funny to listen to. I think that hearing the Doctor interact with the older version of Vicki is also very refreshing. But then at times I did think that the story did slow down quite considerably. I did think, oh, maybe a few extra scenes, maybe a few additional challenges would have just elevated the story a little bit more to keep that momentum going. But then again, you can kind of come to expect that from a story which is split between 6 parts. I think it will always, no matter what, struggle to keep that momentum throughout, and if it did, it will probably then be incredibly exhausting to listen to. So very much like how I mentioned at the start of this review, I definitely recommend pacing the listening experience of this story. If I recall correctly, I think the way that I did it was split it into 1 hour chunks, so parts 1 and 2, 3 and 4, and then I went away in between and did other things. I think I split it across 2 days or something like that, and that way I think the references didn't go completely over my head, and the scenes and the mission within the story didn't just all blur into one, and then you thought, we're here, now we're here, what are we doing? So there we go, another successful box set from the First Doctor Adventures range. I think that if you have enjoyed the previous volumes, then I definitely recommend this one. And if you are looking to get into this range, I do recommend maybe checking out one of the previous volumes prior to this one, simply because, in my personal opinion, a big 6-part story equals a bigger challenge compared to the smaller scale stories that we see within the previous volumes. But it's a story with lots of spirit, excellent production values, and I'm very looking forward to hearing where this range goes next. But one thing is certain, don't get between a Dalek and a domesticated quadruped mammal.